We begin with Stephen King. He is a national treasurer of terror. Since the publication of his first book, Carrie, in 1974, Stephen King has written 27 novels that have sold 150 million copies worldwide and made him very rich. His work, including The Shining and Misery, has been adapted into 24 feature films and 6 television productions. His latest book, Nightmares and Dreamscapes, is a retrospective of King's phenomenal career, including many hard-to-find stories and several that are being published for the first time. We're very pleased to have him with us this time. Welcome.
Thank you, Charlie. It's nice to be here.
It is really good to have you here. We've wanted to do this for a while. Tell me, what kind of books do you write?
Well, if you ask the ordinary run-of-the-mill reader if there is such a guy or such a gal, I guess that I write horror novels. I think that what I actually write are suspense novels.
What's the difference?
I think that the purpose of the horror novel is to sort of gross you out. My idea of it is, and I'm not averse to this, I will do this, it's part of the fun of it, is it's kind of it's a childish thing, the way that humor is. The two things are closely allied. They both elicit, when they work to their best, a vocal reaction from the audience. Laughter if it's comedy, and a scream or a yell if it's horror. But they're both childish, and it's kind of like when you're a kid and you're sitting at the dining room table and you want to get to your sister or your brother, you kind of chew up your food and then you hang your mouth open like that. That's horror. Suspense is a little more high class than that, so maybe that's why
my mother used to say that was tasteless.
That's tasteless, yeah, that's right. Well, my mother, when I was a kid, used to say, "Stephen, your taste is all in your mouth." And that's true, but it has made me relatively wealthy.
Yes, it has. Not even relatively, very.
But I have a lot of relatives,
Yeah.
so.
Do you know where it all comes from? I mean, it comes out of your imagination, but why this for you? Why not other kinds of novels?
No, I don't know where it all comes from, and that's the literal, unvarnished truth. I don't know where it comes from any more than I know where the color of my eyes comes from.
Well, I can tell you where
know.
that comes from.
Well, all right, that's genetically
Right.
inherited from your mother and your father. And my mother used to enjoy writing, and my father wrote a lot of stories and mailed them to the pulp magazines of the 40s and 50s, like Argosy and that sort of thing. And I guess some of them were pretty good, but I've never seen any of them. So I have a little of that from my parents, and my children have a little of it from me.
You wanted to write from an early age.
Yeah, it was what there was for me. I always did it. I always took great pleasure in it. I still take great pleasure in it. The actual act of composition. For me, the part that I don't like starts when you turn a manuscript in to the publisher. That's like you have your own private field that's full of snow in the backyard, and nobody's tracking it but you, and you give it to them, and then they open it to the public.
You mean that whole creation is only yours, and only you know those characters? Your editor, but forget that. You are the only person who's lived with them, know where they're going, what they think, how they conflict, what's going to happen to them.
And I'm the only one that has an opinion on that. And then an editor comes along and says, well, we'll change this and that. This new one, Nightmares and Dreamscapes, a lot of the stories go back half my lifetime, actually. And so some of them were written by a very young man. And then the editor comes up and says, well, maybe if you change this or tweak that. And it's not that they're wrong. That's not what I'm saying. It's that you say, well, that was mine for a long time. Now you come in here and it's maybe too. I'm from Maine. I'm a Yankee. Maybe that's a Yankee reaction. You know, leave my backyard alone.
Do you create characters you like?
Usually I do, but I don't always create characters that I like. Sometimes I create the sort of characters that I'm afraid of. When I was a kid,
you're afraid of?
Yeah. When I was a kid, there was a guy who, maybe the first of the modern serial killers. He was a guy named Charlie Starkweather.
Right.
And
he was a guy off the Texas
right.
Tower.
A little bandy. No, that's much later than this. Starkweather was in Nebraska, and he was in the 50s. And I had a scrapbook. I cut out all these clippings of him, and my mother found this scrapbook. It was 57, so I would have been about 10 years old. And I think she decided right then and there that not all my wheels were on the road anymore. And
your elevator was not going to the top floor.
She said, why are you interested in this guy? And because I was only 10, and what articulation I had then went into the stories, and it really still does. I'm a much better writer than I am a talker. What I was not able to tell her was, there was one picture of this young man who killed these people, and what there was in his eyes was nothing at all. I mean, vacant rooms, depopulated planets, there was nothing. And what I was not able to tell her was, I need to look out for this guy. I need to know everything about him so that if I ever meet him or anybody like him, I can go around. And in my fiction, when I've created characters like John Rainbird in Firestarter, or George Stark in The Dark Half, some of the real bad guys, I'm telling myself, reminding myself, look out for these guys. These guys are dangerous, and they're really out there.
But when you were, how old did you do this? This is when you were 9?
About 10.
Yeah. Now, did you try to write anything then when you were 9 and 10?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and a lot of it was the sort of stuff that I write now. There were horror stories, fantasy stories. See, I grew up on a diet of, let's say, the sort of comic books that kids weren't really supposed to read, like Tales from the Crypt and The Vault of Horror and that sort of thing. One of the earliest stories that I remember my mother reading my brother and I was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So you see, I was warped from an early age, but the idea that this sort of thing, you know, somebody will sort of want to discuss your books if you write what I write, and they'll sort of sidle up to you and say, by the way, what was your childhood like?
Of course they do.
But mine was perfectly normal as a general case.
Back to the question I asked about what kind of books do you write? Do you compare yourself with no false modesty to anyone? When you look back, who would you like to be compared to? Where do you put your work?
Generally, once it's done and bound and in a book, I put it on the shelf and forget it
or send it to Hollywood and say, send the check.
Yeah. There are writers that I like. Yeah. There are writers that I admire tremendously, and there are writers whose styles have helped me at various times that I've sort of taken into my own mix and tried to make a part of myself. I think that writers, when they're forming, are like what my mother always used to say, milk in the refrigerator takes the flavor of whatever's next to it, you know, so that as a kid, if I read a lot of H.P. Lovecraft, I'd write like Lovecraft. There are a couple of pastiches in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, the new book. There's a Sherlock Holmes story that was written as part of a competition at a mystery weekend in Mohawk in upstate New York. And there's also a Chandler-esque Philip Marlowe hard-boiled detective story, because I admire that style tremendously. You know what I like? I don't necessarily want to be compared to anybody.
No, but just tell me who, you know, because there are people, the reason I asked the question, there are many who say, and this is complimentary to you, look back years from now, we'll look back at what Stephen King was writing, and we'll see you in a very different way as the audience who loves you so much and buys 150 million copies sees you. They may very well be responding to these sort of base emotions of a great story, first of all. I don't think that you would sell unless you tell a great story. I assume that you believe that as well.
And hey, if they remember me at all,
yeah.
I mean, it's amazing when you think about it, the writers who come and enjoy tremendous popularity and sort of disappear so that you find their works on back shelves in hotel suites or in, you know, bargain barns in New England. If I could write one book, let's say, in my genre that would be remembered the way that Dracula has been remembered. I love the idea of the novel Dracula because it's shameless pulp fiction, and it's melodramatic, and it has a lot of things in it that critics consider to be vices, and yet it's enjoyed its own life.
It stood the test of time.
That's right.
Yeah. And do you believe yours will stand the test of time?
Boy, I'd like to think so, and I think some of it has a chance because horror fiction, as a general rule, lives its own guerrilla life, so that sometimes it's the kind of thing where one kid will tell another, have you read this? You know, and they'll go and get it out of the library, and I think that some of that stuff does have a tendency to last.
What, both on the superficial level, at the top level,